Imagine believing you are chosen by the gods themselves, that your will shapes the world, that nations exist only to kneel before your throne. That was the mind of Xerxes I, king of kings, ruler of the vast Persian Empire. In 480 BCE, he looked west toward a small, divided land called Greece, and saw not nations but insolent city-states that had dared to defy his father Darius a decade earlier. Xerxes would finish what his father started. He would erase Greece, burn Athens to the ground, and remind the world that no mortal could resist Persia. So he built the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient historians claim his army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Some even said 1 million men marched under his banners. The real figure was likely smaller, but it was still enormous by any measure. Entire nations fed into that machine. Soldiers from Babylon, Egypt, India, and Anatolia filled his ranks. His fleet of warships stretched across the sea, a floating city of soldiers and slaves. To Xerxes, this wasn't just war, it was divine justice. But there was one thing Xerxes never understood. In war, size can be a weakness. When he crossed into Greece, his path was straightforward. From the north, his army would march down the narrow corridors of mountain and sea, while his navy shadowed him along the coast, supplying the troops. On the map, it looked inevitable. The Greeks had too few soldiers, too few ships, and too many rivalries to stand united. Yet at one crucial point, the Persians' unstoppable advance met something immovable. The pass of Thermopylae, hot gates. Thermopylae wasn't just a narrow road. It was a natural bottleneck, carved by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. At its narrowest point, it was barely wide enough for a chariot to pass. It was the kind of place where a handful of men could stop an army. And that's exactly what happened. The Greeks, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, chose this choke point deliberately. It wasn't random bravery. It was strategy precise and calculated. They knew they could never win a battle in the open. The Persian cavalry and archers would shred them apart. But in the tight pass of Thermopylae, numbers meant nothing. The Persians would be forced to fight in small groups, where the heavily armored Greek hoplites could hold their ground. Leonidas didn't intend to survive. He intended to stall. Every hour his men held the pass was one more day for the rest of Greece to prepare. When Xerxes reached Thermopylae and saw the narrow strip of land defended by only a few thousand men, he couldn't believe it. The great king laughed. To him, this wasn't resistance, it was an insult. He sent messengers demanding the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas simply replied, "Come and take them." That single phrase Laba summed up everything Xerxes misunderstood about his enemy. The Greeks weren't fighting for conquest or riches. They were fighting because they refused to kneel. Xerxes mistook this defiance for arrogance. He thought their stand would crumble the moment they saw the size of his army. But what he didn't realize was that the Greeks had chosen the battlefield precisely because it made his size irrelevant. The first attacks came in waves. Xerxes ordered his Medes and Scythians to advance, expecting the small Greek line to break instantly. Instead, his soldiers were slaughtered. The Greek phalanx, tight wall of bronze shields and spears, was almost impossible to penetrate in that narrow space. Every time the Persians charged, the Greeks pushed them back. Bodies began to pile up so high that they blocked the path. Xerxes, still confident, sent in his elite Unitha immortals. They were the best soldiers in his empire, named for their supposed invincibility. But against the Spartans and their allies, they found no weakness. The narrow terrain forced them into single-file combat, where their light armor was no match for Greek bronze. The immortals died like ordinary men. Day after day, Xerxes threw his army at the pass, and each time, the result was the same. The Greeks didn't just hold, they humiliated him. Every failed assault was a wound to his pride. His men began to lose faith. The great king, who claimed to command the world, couldn't even move a few thousand men through a mountain pass. The truth was becoming clear. Xerxes' greatest weapon, his massive army, was useless here. Thermopylae exposed a fatal flaw in his thinking. Xerxes saw war as a show of power. The Greeks saw it as a game of geometry. They understood terrain, they studied movement, they chose their ground like chess masters choosing the board. Xerxes chose it like a man picking a stage. It wasn't that Xerxes didn't have options. He could have bypassed the pass, used his navy to outflank the Greeks, or waited for his scouts to find another route. But waiting wasn't in his nature. Patience would mean admitting that the Greeks had forced him to stop. To a king who believed himself divine, that was impossible. So he ordered more attacks. More men died. The pass remained closed. What happened next would change the entire course of the campaign. A local Greek trader named Ephialtes approached the Persians and revealed a hidden path through the mountains that could be used to outflank Leonidas's position. When Xerxes heard this, he saw his chance not just to win, but to humiliate the defenders once and for all. He sent a force to circle behind them. But even when Leonidas learned of the betrayal, he didn't run. He dismissed most of the allied troops and stayed behind with his 300 Spartans, a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who refused to leave. They would fight to the last man. They knew they couldn't stop the Persians forever, but they could make every inch of ground cost the enemy dearly. When the Persians finally surrounded them, the Greeks fought until their spears broke, then with their swords, and finally with their bare hands. By the time Xerxes took the pass, thousands of his men were dead, and the cost of victory was ruinous. The path was open, but the price was humiliation. The world saw that the greatest army on earth had been halted by a few hundred men. Thermopylae wasn't a Persian triumph, it was a warning. In pure numbers, Xerxes had won. In strategy, he had lost. He had been trapped by his own arrogance, unable to see that sometimes the smallest piece of land can destroy the largest army. His mistake was thinking that overwhelming force could replace understanding. He didn't read the terrain. He didn't read the enemy. He only read his own ego. Thermopylae became more than a battle, it became a symbol of discipline, defeating excess. The Greeks had turned nature itself into an ally. Every cliff, every stone, every narrow turn worked against Persia. And in doing so, they revealed a timeless truth about power. When you believe you are unstoppable, you stop seeing the limits around you. Xerxes didn't lose Thermopylae because he lacked soldiers. He lost it because he lacked humility. And if you're fascinated by how the overconfidence of empires leads to their downfall, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we explore the brilliance and blindness that shaped the ancient world. Xerxes believed war was a demonstration of divine will. When the great king commanded, the world was meant to bend. He had never known resistance that didn't crumble at the sight of his banners. That belief absolute and untested became his downfall at Thermopylae. The pass was already a trap, but his response turned it into a graveyard for his own men. When Xerxes saw the Greek line holding firm, he didn't pause to think or adapt. He reacted the way absolute rulers often do, by assuming that more force would solve everything. To him, hesitation was weakness. Reflection was for philosophers, not kings. So he ordered a direct assault, confident that overwhelming pressure would simply break the defenders apart. The first waves were composed of his lighter infantry, troops drawn from across the Empire Medes, Scythians, Persians. These soldiers were brave, but they weren't trained for the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that the Spartans specialized in. Their armor was thin, their shields small, their weapons designed for speed and mobility, not endurance. Against the bronze wall of the Greek phalanx, they might as well have been charging a cliff. The phalanx was more than a formation, it was an engine of war. Each man's shield protected the man to his left, forming a continuous barrier of bronze and oak. Behind that wall, long spears projected outward like the teeth of a predator. To break it, you needed space, coordination, and heavy pressure from all sides. The Persians had none of those advantages in the narrow pass. They were forced to attack in waves so dense that they blocked their own retreat. The moment they met the Greek line, their numbers turned against them. Ancient accounts describe the Persian dead piling so high that the survivors had to climb over their bodies to reach the enemy. For the Spartans, this was exactly what they wanted. Their discipline held, their formation didn't waver, and their iron focus made every strike deliberate. They fought in rotation, fresh soldiers, stepping forward while the tired fell back, ensuring their endurance far outlasted anything Xerxes expected. But Xerxes didn't understand the tactical difference between chaos and control. He had mistaken numbers for superiority, a mistake that has doomed generals for centuries. When his first assaults failed, he didn't stop to analyze why. He blamed the incompetence of his men, not the limits of his strategy. So he ordered more of them forward. The same narrow pass, the same armor, the same outcome, thousands dead, the line unbroken. For the Persians, this was more than physical defeat. It was psychological collapse. The great king had promised an easy victory, a show of divine might. But as the days passed, and the Greeks still stood, doubt spread like a disease. The men began to see the narrow pass not as a battlefield, but as a death trap. Still, Xerxes refused to change course. His ego had trapped him as surely as his army was trapped in the pass. Every failure only deepened his need to prove himself. To retreat or pause would mean acknowledging that the Greeks had outsmarted him, so he doubled down. When his regular troops failed, he sent in the immortals, the elite guard, his most disciplined and decorated warriors. They were called immortals because their ranks were always kept full. If one fell, another immediately took his place. They were armed better, trained longer, and fought closer to the king. Xerxes believed they would crush the Greeks through sheer superiority. But even they failed. The immortals were specialists in open terrain, where their agility and precision could dominate. In Thermopylae's narrow confines, those advantages meant nothing. Their shields were too small to withstand the Greek spears. Their lighter armor meant for speed was useless when trapped shoulder to shoulder. Every time they advanced, they were pushed back, their momentum absorbed and redirected by the phalanx. The Greeks, fighting from behind heavy shields, used short bursts of coordinated movement shield bashes, synchronized thrusts, quick replacements to turn the confined space into a weapon. Imagine the sound, the clanging of bronze, the grunts of exertion, the shouts of officers trying to rally men who couldn't even move freely. For the Persians, it must have felt like fighting a machine. No matter how many they killed, more Greeks filled the gaps. The formation didn't scatter, didn't panic, didn't retreat. It just advanced one step at a time. By the end of the first day, the Persian losses were staggering. Bodies carpeted the narrow strip of land between mountain and sea. The water turned red. Even the immortals had been broken. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne set up on a nearby rise, reportedly leaped from his seat 3 times in anger and disbelief. He had never seen an enemy refuse to yield. That night, while the Greeks rested behind their shields, the Persians tried to recover their dead and regroup. The great king's advisors urged him to reconsider his tactics. He ignored them. The next day, he ordered more attacks. Again, the same result. Every hour, his casualties mounted, while the Greeks remained intact. To the Greeks, it must have felt almost surreal, watching the most powerful empire in the world destroy itself through arrogance. But they understood something Xerxes didn't. In war, pride kills more armies than swords do. What's remarkable about Thermopylae is that it wasn't just a clash of men. It was a clash of mindsets. The Persians fought to fulfill a command. The Greeks fought to defend an idea. Leonidas and his men were not defending Thermopylae for personal gain. They were buying time for all of Greece to unite, to prepare for the larger battles ahead. Every fallen Persian soldier was another moment earned for Athens and the other city-states to organize. In that sense, Xerxes' arrogance gave the Greeks exactly what they needed. His insistence on frontal assaults, his inability to adapt, and his refusal to acknowledge tactical limits slowed his entire campaign. He turned what should have been a swift invasion into a drawn-out siege against a few thousand men. It's tempting to view Xerxes' actions as purely foolish, but there's a deeper pattern here. His behavior mirrors the downfall of every overconfident ruler in history. When power becomes absolute, learning stops. When no one dares question the king, his mistakes multiply. In the Persian court, disagreement was dangerous. Advisors told Xerxes what he wanted to hear, that his army was unstoppable, that the Greeks were weak, that the gods were on his side. And so he acted as if the world would obey him simply because he commanded it. But the battlefield doesn't care about titles. Thermopylae reminded the world that nature and discipline can humble even an empire. Xerxes' assaults didn't just fail tactically, they shattered the illusion of invincibility that sustained his empire's myth. His soldiers, who had believed they were part of a divine mission, now saw their comrades dying senselessly in front of them. The aura of the great king began to fade. What's most striking is how modern this pattern feels. Every empire, every leader who believes themselves infallible, repeats the same mistake. They treat strength as a substitute for understanding. They trust intimidation more than adaptation. And when faced with resistance that doesn't yield, they keep pushing until they break themselves. At Thermopylae, Xerxes learned that lesson too late. His arrogance turned a calculated campaign into a bloodbath. His need to dominate blinded him to the terrain, the psychology, and the discipline of his enemy. In the end, his soldiers weren't defeated by numbers, they were defeated by one man's pride. The Greeks would lose Thermopylae, but they had already won something far greater, proof that the mightiest army on earth could bleed, and that proof would ignite a fire across Greece that Xerxes could never put out. The battle might have lasted longer, if not for one man's greed. In war, it's rarely brute force alone that decides an outcome. More often, it's betrayal. The Greeks at Thermopylae had faced down overwhelming numbers, brutal assaults, and sleepless nights, but what they could not fight was treachery. That came in the form of a man named Ephialtes, whose name would forever become synonymous with nightmare in Greek memory. Ephialtes wasn't a warrior or a commander. He was a local from the Malian region, familiar with every twist and slope of the mountains around Thermopylae. He had grown up in the shadow of those cliffs, where narrow tracks wound through forests and hidden gullies. To him, those paths were ordinary. To Xerxes, they were salvation. By the third day, Xerxes was desperate. His army had bled for 2 days against a handful of defenders. Every frontal attack had failed. His confidence, once unshakable, was eroding with every corpse hauled off the field. His advisors whispered caution. His pride refused to hear it. He needed a way around the Greeks, and he needed it now. That's when Ephialtes appeared. Accounts differ on how the meeting happened. Some say he approached the Persian camp on his own, lured by the promise of gold. Others claim he was captured and offered to bargain for his life. What is certain is that he offered Xerxes something no general had managed to achieve, a way to end the stalemate. He told the Persians of a hidden path through the mountains, a trail that wound behind the Greek position. If the Persians could move quietly and quickly through that pass, they could surround Leonidas and his men. For Xerxes, it was the perfect opportunity. He didn't question Ephialtes' motives. He didn't pause to wonder if the information was reliable. A man like Xerxes didn't need to trust. He needed only to command. He saw the chance to crush the Greeks from behind and restore his image of unstoppable power. That night, under cover of darkness, Xerxes ordered his elite Unitha immortals to move. These were the best soldiers in his army, hand-picked and disciplined. Their armor gleamed in the torchlight as they climbed the narrow trail. The air grew colder and thinner as they ascended. Below them, the faint glow of campfires marked where Leonidas' men slept, unaware of what was coming. The path Ephialtes described was called the Anapeia. It was steep, winding, and known only to locals and shepherds. The Greeks knew of its existence, but had stationed only a small contingent of Phocian soldiers to guard it, believing the rugged terrain would be enough of a defense. It was a fatal miscalculation. As the immortals moved through the forest, the sound of their boots and armor echoed faintly through the trees. When they encountered the Phocians, a brief clash erupted. Startled and outnumbered, the Phocians fell back up the mountain, assuming the Persians meant to attack them directly. But the immortals had no interest in a prolonged fight. They bypassed the defenders entirely, continuing along the path that would bring them down behind the Spartan line. By dawn, the Persians were in position. The trap was closing. Below, Leonidas had already begun to sense that something was wrong. Scouts and local allies brought word that the pass had been betrayed. The realization must have hit like a physical blow. For 2 days, his men had fought an impossible battle and held their ground. Now, through treachery, all of it was coming undone. It's hard to imagine the silence in that Spartan camp when Leonidas told his men the truth. They weren't going to survive. The Persians were coming from both directions, one force ahead, one behind. There would be no escape, but the Spartan way of war left no room for retreat. Their training had taught them to hold the line, no matter the cost, and so they prepared not to flee. Xerxes, for his part, believed the end was near. The night march had gone smoothly. His immortals were in place. He expected that, by midday, the Greek defense would collapse completely. In his mind, the betrayal had finally balanced the scales, but it's worth noting how quickly he seized upon treachery once brute strength failed him. The great king, who claimed to be favored by the gods, had resorted to trusting a single outcast Greek to save his campaign. Ephialtes likely thought his act would bring him wealth and safety. He imagined Persian gold, land, or titles as his reward. What he didn't foresee was how deeply the Greeks would loathe him for what he'd done. In every corner of Greece, his name became a curse. Ephialtes would come to mean nightmare in the Greek, language of fitting legacy for a man who sold out his countrymen in their darkest hour. When the immortals descended from the mountain, the Greek position collapsed into chaos. The men guarding the rear realized they were cut off. Leonidas sent many of the allied troops away Thespians, Thebans, and others to carry word of what had happened and to prepare for the next phase of the war. But the Spartans stayed. They knew they would die, and they chose it. What's often lost in retellings is the sheer tension of that morning. The air would have been thick with dust and sweat, the smell of burned oil and blood from the previous days still clinging to the ground. The Spartans formed their ranks again, not for victory, but for honor. Behind them, the cliffs dropped to the sea. In front, the Persian army advanced once more, and soon, behind them, the immortals closed in from the mountains. Xerxes had finally achieved what his arrogance could not accomplish through forced encirclement. But even then, the Greeks refused to make it easy. The final clash was brutal and intimate. With their spears broken, the Spartans drew their swords. When their shields splintered, they fought with their hands. They pushed forward again and again, killing as they fell. It wasn't a rout, it was a deliberate act of defiance. Meanwhile, Ephialtes' role faded into the background. He had done his part and vanished, hoping to enjoy his reward. But the Persian victory at Thermopylae was not as complete as he or Xerxes imagined. The Greeks' sacrifice bought time. Their stand inspired unity across the Greek world. And Ephialtes' betrayal, rather than breaking their spirit, hardened it. His name became a warning that no reward was worth the stain of treason. After the war, when the Persians had been driven back and the Greeks reclaimed their lands, Ephialtes became a hunted man. The Amphictyonic Council, ancient Greek assembly, declared a bounty on his head. Eventually, he was found and killed, though not by the Spartans. Some sources say he died at the hands of another Greek seeking justice. Others claim he was struck down by coincidence, recognized, and executed like a criminal. Either way, his reward for betrayal was death, and his memory lived on as the ultimate example of shame. But from Xerxes' perspective, the betrayal had been a success. He had broken the Greek line. The pass was his. His army could now march south toward Athens. Yet, even in victory, there was an uneasy faint realization that this had not been a triumph of strength or strategy, but of luck and deceit. The great king who once believed he could conquer through will alone had won only by trusting a traitor. That irony lingered. In time, the Persians would discover that victory achieved through betrayal carries its own curse. For the Greeks, the story of Ephialtes became a lesson about integrity and endurance. For Xerxes, it marked the high point of his campaign, the moment when his path forward seemed clear. But what followed would reveal that betrayal, while effective in the short term, cannot hold an empire together. At Thermopylae, the betrayal of one man reshaped the fate of nations. But it also exposed the difference between what men fight for and what they sell. Ephialtes fought for himself, and his reward was death. Leonidas fought for his people, and his death became legend. Leonidas understood the full weight of the situation. The hidden path revealed by Ephialtes meant that the Greek position at Thermopylae was no longer defensible. Retreat would preserve lives, but it would also abandon the opportunity to shape the course of the war. He chose the harder path, a deliberate tactical sacrifice that would echo through history. The 300 Spartans, along with a few hundred Thespians and Thebans, remained to hold the pass. They were fully aware that their stand was likely their last. Every spear in the phalanx, every shield pressed against the next, became part of a living wall designed not to win the battle, but to buy time. The rest of the Greek army athletes, hoplites, and citizen militias from across the Peloponnesus used those hours to regroup, retreat, and prepare for the next engagement against the Persian advance. The Spartan ethos was perfectly suited to this moment. From childhood, each warrior had been trained to value honor, discipline, and loyalty above all else. For Leonidas' men, the idea of dying for their city-state was not abstract, it was ingrained. They knew the Persian numbers were overwhelming, but they also knew that by holding the pass, they were doing something far larger than themselves. When dawn broke, the Spartans advanced in formation. Their phalanx bristled with spears, their bronze shields gleamed in the morning light. Persian scouts spotted them from the high ground and reported back. Xerxes must have thought that by now the Greeks would be fleeing. Instead, he saw the Spartan line holding firm, defiant, unbroken, and aware that every strike could be their last. The fighting was brutal. The Spartans engaged the Persian vanguard, taking the brunt of the enemy's assault. Every wave of Persian soldiers that pressed forward was met with the disciplined resistance of Leonidas' line. The narrow terrain amplified the Greeks' defensive advantage. The Persians could not bring their numbers to bear effectively. Each man was forced to fight in a confined space where their numerical superiority counted for little. This stand, though doomed to end in death for the Spartans, had an immediate strategic effect. The delay allowed Greek reinforcements to fall back in order, avoiding the chaos of a full-scale rout. The Athenians could evacuate the city as the Persian army advanced. Ships from other city-states were able to maneuver without interference. Supply lines were protected. Every hour the Spartans held the line was another hour for the Greek coalition to prepare for the decisive engagements that would follow at Salamis and Plataea. The psychological impact was equally profound. News of the Spartans' courage spread rapidly among the Greek city-states. They did not merely witness a defeat, they saw an example of unyielding resolve. The tale of the 300 and their allies became a rallying point. A story that reminded every Greek soldier that discipline, courage, and unity could check even the greatest of empires. The stand at Thermopylae transformed a tactical loss into a strategic victory by inspiring collective action and resolve. Leonidas' decision illustrates a rare type of military thinking, the conscious use of sacrifice to achieve a broader objective. In most battles, the goal is immediate victory or survival. Here, Leonidas prioritized the war's trajectory over the fight at hand. His calculation was clear: by sacrificing a few hundred, he could save thousands, and buy time for the coalition that would ultimately repel the Persian invasion. This moment also reveals the interplay between morale and strategy. The Spartans' willingness to fight to the last man sent a message to both the Persians and the Greeks. To the Persians, it demonstrated that conquering Greece would not be easy. To the Greeks, it served as an emotional spark, a reminder that even the smallest, most disciplined force could shape the course of history when acting with purpose and cohesion. The geography, the training, and the psychological preparation all converged at Thermopylae. The narrow pass amplified the effectiveness of Leonidas' small force. Every spear thrust, every shield block bought critical time. Every man who fell did so knowing that his death had a purpose beyond his own survival. They became more than soldiers. They became symbols of resistance, illustrating how sacrifice could serve strategy, not merely valor. Even as the Spartans fell, their stand allowed the broader Greek forces to preserve cohesion. Armies that might have been scattered or demoralized were instead able to regroup and reorganize. This cohesion proved decisive in subsequent battles, particularly at Salamis, where the Greek navy exploited the Persian fleet's overextension and lack of maneuverability. Thermopylae was not an isolated act of bravery. It was a crucial link in a chain of strategic maneuvers that ultimately thwarted Xerxes' ambitions. In a tactical sense, the sacrifice at Thermopylae converted defeat into a form of strategic leverage. The Persians gained ground, but at a cost. The psychological victory remained with the Greeks. By holding the pass, the Spartans delayed the enemy advance long enough to prevent the immediate collapse of Greek defensive plans. Their deaths were not in vain. They directly influenced the operational environment in which the Greek forces could continue resisting effectively. The Spartan stand also forced Xerxes to contend with the limitations of his massive army. His overwhelming numbers were neutralized by terrain and discipline. Every wave of attack that met the Spartan line produced casualties without achieving decisive results. The psychological strain on the Persian command was substantial. They realized that brute force alone would not guarantee conquest. Even in victory, the Persians were forced to expend precious time and resources navigating the consequences of this tactical delay. Leonidas' choice underscores a critical lesson in military history. The value of sacrifice is not always measured in lives lost on the field, but in the effects that loss creates in the broader strategic context. By embracing the inevitability of defeat for a small contingent, he was able to ensure operational continuity, preserve morale among allies, and shape the psychological and practical conditions necessary for ultimate victory. This is the essence of Thermopylae's legacy. The 300 Spartans, along with their Thespian and Theban allies, became a force multiplier not through numbers or material advantage, but through the deliberate application of sacrifice, discipline, and the amplification of their symbolic presence. Their deaths were carefully orchestrated, turning what might have been a simple rout into a calculated act that bought time, inspired allies, and reinforced the Greek capacity for collective resistance. In short, Leonidas' decision to hold the pass exemplifies strategic sacrifice. The narrow pass, the disciplined phalanx, and the awareness of the larger operational picture allowed a small force to influence the course of an entire war. By choosing to fight to the last man, the Spartans did more than delay the Persian advance. They ensured that the Greek city-states would remain capable of mounting a coordinated and effective defense, setting the stage for future victories that would protect their homeland and preserve their culture. The 300 Spartans' stand is remembered not as a loss, but as a masterclass in turning the inevitability of death into a force multiplier. Their decision to embrace sacrifice, fully aware of the cost, exemplifies how strategy can incorporate human resolve and morale as critical instruments of war. In doing so, Thermopylae became far more than a battle. It became a symbol of tactical brilliance shaped by courage and purpose. Mention liking, commenting, and subscribing to Dumb Historian. Xerxes' overconfidence at Thermopylae had immediate consequences that rippled across both land and sea. While his massive army pressed forward, he failed to account for the time gained by the Greek defenders, particularly the Spartans and their allies, who had held the narrow pass with remarkable discipline. That delay allowed the Greek naval commanders, led by Themistocles, to organize and position their forces for the decisive engagement at Salamis. Xerxes' miscalculation was compounded by his reliance on sheer numbers rather than tactical foresight. The Persian navy, enormous in scale, consisted of ships that were designed for open water battles and massed formations. They were powerful but unwieldy. Xerxes assumed that the sheer volume of ships would overwhelm any resistance and provide unassailable support for his land forces. What he failed to anticipate was the intelligence and cunning of the Greek commanders. The narrow straits off the coast of Salamis were chosen deliberately by Themistocles, who understood the limitations of the Persian fleet in confined waters. Here, the advantages of numerical superiority and raw size were neutralized, while the agility and maneuverability of the Greek triremes were maximized. The Persians, forced into these straits, quickly became entangled. Ships collided, oars became fouled, and the rigid formations that were effective in open water fell apart. Greek commanders took advantage of every confusion, ramming Persian ships from multiple angles, breaking lines, and systematically reducing the enemy fleet. The smaller Greek vessels could pivot quickly, strike and retreat, then strike again, maintaining constant pressure. In contrast, the massive Persian ships, laden with soldiers and dependent on coordination among hundreds of rowers, were slow to respond and vulnerable to repeated attacks. Xerxes' impatience worsened the situation. He demanded rapid progress and immediate engagement, echoing his behavior at Thermopylae, where frontal assaults had led to catastrophic losses. His leadership style, reliant on intimidation and expectation of obedience, could not adapt to the tactical flexibility required in naval combat under these conditions. Meanwhile, Themistocles had studied Persian tendencies and exploited their predictable decision-making patterns. He had anticipated that Xerxes' desire for a fast, decisive victory would lead him to commit his fleet prematurely into an environment where Greek advantages were magnified. The psychological impact on the Persian commanders was significant. Once their ships became jammed and collisions spread chaos, morale faltered. Trained rowers and experienced sailors could not coordinate attacks or retreats effectively, and the sense of being trapped in a bottleneck amplified panic. Greek crews, in contrast, operated in smaller units with high cohesion, able to adapt to changing circumstances quickly. Every successful ram, every overturned Persian vessel, reinforced the confidence and coordination of the Greeks, while the Persians were left scrambling in disarray. Strategically, the Battle of Salamis was a turning point. The Persian land forces, still advancing after Thermopylae, were now dependent on a fleet that could no longer secure supply lines or protect the flanks. Xerxes' numerical advantage on land was undermined by the loss of naval dominance. Ships that could have transported reinforcements, supplies, and troops safely along the coast were now destroyed or trapped. The logistical backbone of the Persian invasion was critically weakened, demonstrating that tactical miscalculations in one domain, land or sea, can cascade across an entire campaign. The contrast between Greek and Persian command styles further highlights the failure. The Greeks used intelligence, deception, and terrain knowledge to turn a vulnerable position into a decisive advantage. The Persians relied on overwhelming numbers, rigid hierarchy, and overconfidence, assumptions that were exploited at every turn. Themistocles' choice of the straits forced the Persians to fight under conditions that maximized Greek strengths while neutralizing their own. It was a textbook example of using terrain and timing to amplify force effectiveness. Xerxes' failure at Salamis also illustrates the danger of hubris in military planning. By ignoring lessons from Thermopylae, relying on brute force, and underestimating his opponent's ingenuity, he repeated errors on a larger scale. The Persian fleet's collapse was not simply a matter of being outnumbered. Tactically, it was a consequence of strategic misjudgment, overextension, and the inability to adapt to dynamic battlefield conditions. A massive fleet became a liability rather than an asset, proving that size alone cannot compensate for poor situational awareness and inflexibility. The aftermath of the naval defeat cemented the Greeks' control over the strategic initiative. With the Persian fleet crippled, the Greek city-states could coordinate defenses, secure supply lines, and plan counteroffensives without immediate threat of encirclement or coastal assault. Xerxes, confronted with the limits of his power, was forced to reconsider the conduct of his campaign, eventually retreating and leaving portions of his army vulnerable. The combination of disciplined sacrifice at Thermopylae and calculated naval tactics at Salamis ensured that the Persian invasion ultimately failed, turning what could have been an unstoppable force into a vulnerable, demoralized, occupying army. Salamis demonstrates a core principle of military strategy. Numerical superiority is irrelevant without situational awareness, adaptability, and the intelligent use of terrain. Xerxes' inability to recognize these factors turned his fleet into a trap of his own making. Each Persian ship that ran aground or was sunk by a Greek trireme was a tangible symbol of his miscalculation, reinforcing the tactical lessons learned at Thermopylae about the dangers of arrogance, impatience, and underestimating a smaller, disciplined opponent. The battle also emphasizes the synergy between land and naval operations. Thermopylae delayed the Persian army, and Salamis exploited that delay, demonstrating how interconnected theaters of war can magnify the effects of tactical and strategic decisions. The Greeks' ability to coordinate across domains allowed them to turn small-scale engagements into decisive empire-altering outcomes, highlighting the importance of timing, terrain exploitation, and psychological warfare in military planning. Ultimately, the Persian fleet's defeat at Salamis sealed the failure of Xerxes' campaign. The navy, which should have secured the lines of communication and maintained operational momentum, became a source of vulnerability. The invasion, once seemingly unstoppable, was forced into retreat, and the Greeks gained confidence and initiative. The tactical brilliance of the Greeks, combined with Xerxes' repeated misjudgments, illustrates how strategy, terrain, discipline, and psychological insight can overcome overwhelming numbers. The lessons of Salamis are clear. Never underestimate an opponent's ingenuity, never rely solely on numbers, and never allow ego and impatience to dictate strategy. Xerxes' failure demonstrates that even the largest, most powerful forces are constrained by human judgment and the practical limitations of terrain and maneuverability. His miscalculations at Thermopylae and Salamis together turned a campaign that could have conquered Greece into a historic defeat, showcasing the timeless value of discipline, tactical awareness, and strategic patience. Mention liking, commenting, and subscribing to Dumb Historian.